Good morning. Please be seated. So I'm not certain that when they were divvying up sermons for the summer, they quite realized they were handing this particular gospel to a mariner. I've always wanted an excuse to tell some sea tales. Dikembe Dill was the third mate aboard the Spirit of Bermuda in 2019. We called him Mr. Dill in deference to his position as a watch leader and chief navigator of the vessel. He was slight and soft-spoken, his voice a mixture of the deep American South and the lilt of Bermudian English. He didn't talk much about himself, but the few conversations I had with him told me that his 25 years had not been easy ones. He had come to live with his grandmother on Bermuda as a result of poor choices in his teen years. He had found structure in his life with the program aboard the Spirit of Bermuda, first as a teen and then as a crew member. He always said the Spirit had been good to him. So we left St. George's, Bermuda on a sunny morning, headed for Portland. The crew was a combination of students from Maine and students from Bermuda. Our first day, we stopped for a swim call after lunch. "I'm worried about the sharks," said Mr. Dill, as he scrambled up the mainmast and sat in the spreaders to keep watch over the people in the water. Now, to get from Bermuda to Maine, you need to cross the Gulf Stream. And if you are lucky, you can cross it quickly. We were not lucky. A front moved through, and we found ourselves in a 30-knot wind blowing counter to the current of the Gulf Stream. For a day and a half, the seas were confused, coming from multiple directions and 15 to 20 feet in height. Imagine, if you will, sailing in a blender. Below deck, the 20 teenage crew members were sprawled across the cabin's sole, each with their very own green garbage bag. The Spirit of Bermuda is very seaworthy. It's over 100 feet long, has a thick laminated wood hull, carbon fiber masts. Things were uncomfortable, but safe. It was one of those situations in life where the only way out is to go through it. Still, losing the horizon in the trough and then watching the wind whip the foam off the top of the waves at the peaks was unsettling. I spent most of the 36 hours in the cockpit next to the helm. For most of that time, Mr. Dill was at the helm, singing. He was singing a song called Sanctuary. Now, it's not one we hear often, but you'll hear it at youth events or perhaps in churches where guitars are more forward in the liturgy. The straightforward song, lovely, simple melody, and the words are reassuring. It says, "Lord, prepare me to be a sanctuary, pure and holy, tried and true. And with thanksgiving, I will be a living sanctuary, oh, for you." Quietly, almost under his breath, over and over, Mr. Dill sang. It was deeply comforting and peaceful. Mr. Dill's singing affirmed that we would be all right. Well, the tempest passed. We crossed out of the Gulf Stream. The student crew recovered, ate everything that wasn't nailed down, and we had a gorgeous sail up to Casco Bay. In today's gospel, we have another sea story. We join Jesus and his disciples in the midst of their ministry, following the murder of John the Baptist and the feeding of the 5,000 on the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee. Today's reading starts, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, well, he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, Jesus went up the mountain to pray by himself. And while Jesus is praying, the disciples get caught in a storm out on the lake and can't make it to the shore, for they're being, quote, battered by the waves. And they were far from the land, for the wind was against them. Now the disciples, they were experienced boatmen, experienced enough to know how to stay afloat in bad weather. But we get the sense this may have been exceptionally rough. The Sea of Galilee is a lake about the size of Winnipesaukee. It's also, at 700 feet below sea level, the lowest freshwater lake on the planet. It sits on a valley floor, so bad weather can sneak up on you unawares, and the wind has a way of veering around the valley walls, coming from multiple directions at once. 10-foot waves are actually common on the Sea of Galilee, and it doesn't matter how skilled you are, 10-foot waves, if you are in an open boat, mean a lot of stress and a lot of bailing. So here are the disciples up all night, fighting against the wind and bailing out the boat, when Jesus comes to them across the water. Now they panic. Or in the words of today's gospel, they cried out in fear. But Jesus calls out to them, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Let's take a look at that sentence that Jesus utters. Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid. Now, the translator from the Greek made a choice by translating the sentence, "it is I." As Carla Works, a professor of New Testament at Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, notes, the literal translation of the Greek renders it not "it is I," but rather, "I am." Take heart. I am. Do not be afraid. Odd sounding perhaps to our ears, but riveting to the disciples and the Jewish readers of Matthew's gospel. In saying, "I am," Jesus is making a reference to the story of Moses and the burning bush in Exodus. In Exodus, God tells Moses to go free the Hebrews from bondage. Moses, of course, as he is wont to do, tries to get out of it by arguing with God. In Exodus 13, it reads, Moses said to God, "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you.' And they ask me, 'What is his name?' Then what shall I tell them?" God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And God said, "Say this to the people of Israel, 'I am has sent you.'" Now the disciples would have picked up the inference immediately. In fact, Peter, and it is always Peter, immediately challenges the statement and challenges Jesus and says, "If it is you, command me to come to you on the water." Jesus does. Peter takes a few steps, panics, starts to sink, and cries out, "Lord, save me." Jesus grabs him, calls him out for his lack of faith, and then they both get into the boat. At which point, the waters calm, and the disciples say, "Truly, you are the Son of God." So what are we to make of these two sea stories? Well, boats figure prominently in the stories of Jesus that we have in our Gospels. Some of the disciples made their livings as fishermen. Jesus preaches from a boat to the multitudes gathered along the shore. Jesus travels with his disciples back and forth across the lake, preaching to the cities on the shore. Jesus quiets a storm after awakening from a nap in the boat with his disciples. And then, of course, today's gospel, where Jesus walks across the water to the storm-battered disciples, calms the seas, and gets them back on their way. Now, boats also figure prominently in the history of the church. For many years, boats have long been a symbol of the church. In fact, some of the earliest graffiti that you can find in the Holy Land utilizes a boat. You can see some in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, left by 3rd century pilgrims. Church buildings themselves have adopted the language of boats. We sit here in the nave of St. Luke's Cathedral, the root word for nave being navis, meaning boat in Latin. And if you look up, it looks like you're looking down into the hull of a ship. Why does it matter that this I think that an important detail in both today's gospel and in the earlier incident where Jesus calms the waters is this. The calm only happens when Jesus is in the boat. Why does that matter? That the storm is calmed only when Jesus is in the boat? Well, maybe there's a lesson for those of us in the church, and the message might be this, that the church is at its best when Jesus is in the boat. The Lutheran scholar Mark Hoffman notes, when surrounded by adversity, safety and salvation are experienced in the church with Jesus in its midst. One of our tasks as followers of Jesus is to be the hands and feet of Jesus in the church and to help bring God's peace into the midst of adversity, to bring Jesus into the boat. We also need to remember that a ship is not just a vessel, but a vehicle to get somewhere. Today's gospel says that the ship can only move past the storm with Jesus in it. Isn't that true of the church also? That the church can only continue its journey of ministering to the world when Jesus is in it? The question for all of us as followers of Jesus is, how are we going to bring Jesus into the boat? The Kembe Dill had a way through quietly singing his faith. Jesus' presence brought peace to his disciples in the boat. How will we, as followers of Jesus, bring Jesus into our life as the center of the church? For only when Jesus is in the boat can we be a vessel delivering the good news of God's love for the world. Amen.